Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening all. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on shipping's progress towards COP28. My name is Jesse Fonestock. I'm a project director with the Global Maritime Forum, which is the implementing partner of the Getting to Zero Coalition. We hope that many of you are already familiar with the Getting to Zero Coalition and our work. The coalition is an alliance of more than 200 organizations, including 160 companies within the maritime, energy, infrastructure, and finance sectors, and we're supported by key governments. We're committed to getting commercially viable deep-sea zero-emission vessels powered by zero-emission fuels into operation by 2030 and to achieving full decarbonization of the sector by 2050. In the coalition, we build on this commitment by working together to promote industry and policy action on decarbonization, including connecting shipping and shipping's decarbonization to the broader energy transition and climate agendas. Excuse me. And speaking of the broader energy transition and climate agendas, of course, next week, COP28 kicks off in Dubai, where leaders from all over the world get together to discuss ways that we should tackle today's climate, biodiversity, and energy crises. Global shipping is currently contributing to these crises, and yet it can also be a part of the solution. It can catalyze the energy transition, it can stimulate investment, and it can unlock wider social and resilience benefits associated with zero-emission shipping. The IMO's revised greenhouse gas strategy, which was adopted in July, already represents a significant step forward in unlocking these opportunities. It's instilling confidence in the transition. The strategy makes clear the urgency of a large-scale adoption of zero-emission maritime fuels to enable a full, just, and equitable transition. Yet a zero-emission future cannot solely rely on the IMO. It requires global regulations, but global regulations supported by ambitious national and regional policies, along with industry initiatives. In this context, COP28 is a particularly interesting moment for the maritime sector. 2023 is the first global stocktake, and parties to the Paris Agreement have made an assessment of progress towards fulfilling that agreement's goals. While shipping is not part of the Paris Agreement, this creates an opportunity to assess shipping's progress towards its decarbonization goals. In 2021, the Getting to Zero Coalition, UMass, and the High-Level Climate Champion for Shipping published a paper identifying one such goal. If by 2030, the paper argued, the scalable zero-emission fuels that are needed for shipping's full decarbonization accounted for 5% of shipping's fuel use or more, then there'd be a reasonable chance of achieving the full decarbonization of the sector in line with the requirements of the Paris Agreement. Last month, these same three partners published their second report, tracking progress towards this 5% goal. It's a kind of industry stocktake in advance of COP28. This report showed that the 5% target is still achievable, but current progress is not on the desired trajectory. Looking at supply, demand, finance, policy, and civil society, the report identifies progress that has been made, but also the areas where acceleration is crucial. In a minute, I'll hand over to Dr. Tristan Smith from UMass, lead authors of the report, to take you through its findings. After that, we'll be joined by a distinguished industry panel representing the supply, demand, finance, and policy perspectives to get their view on what is happening and what is needed. Through the presentation and the panel discussion, you'll have the chance to ask questions via the Zoom chat. So please do take the opportunity if there's something you'd like to ask. And with that, let me hand over to Tristan for a review of the progress report's findings.
Thank you, Jesse. Just share this. Hopefully that's now visible. Someone give me a thumbs up if they can see it.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Tristan Smith. I'm a researcher at University College London and a director at UMass. The report's authors, lead authors, are actually Catherine Palmer and my colleague Domagoj Marejczyk. So I am presenting this on their behalf and need to give them the credit that they're due for a very thorough and extensive study, which I'm only going to be able to touch on. So do have a look at the link in the app for those who want to go into it in more detail. I'm going to see if I can build on what Jesse's already mentioned about the context for this report. So I'm using this to explain that I think there are three things that need to happen rapidly and in parallel. The first of which is to maximize the energy efficiency of the fleet. That's the existing ships, the new builds that are coming in, and that step is really essential for the 2030 greenhouse gas reduction, given how important efficiency gains will be in maximizing the absolute emission reductions that can be achieved in this near term. But it's also got this additional benefit of minimizing the cost of a zero emission fuel transition. If we have a more energy efficient fleet, we will need less new energy. We will have lower costs of operation with that new energy. The second thing is about lowering the greenhouse gas emissions of the fuel. So we know there are already fuels that are being used, drop-in fuels, biofuels, for example, but also blue fuels that are made from natural gas with CCS, which can help towards the 2030 greenhouse gas reduction objective. Now, most of those fuels do not achieve the depth of greenhouse gas intensity reduction that will be needed by the sector as we get closer to 2040. So these are not necessarily helpful for that long-term objective of a zero emission fuel transition, and we'll go into that in a bit more detail. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for them, especially during that transitional period of time. And then the third element is this stimulation of the zero greenhouse gas emission technology, fuel, supply chains, distribution, bunkering, fleet, technology, etc. And all of that is critical for the smooth transition to 2040 without at risk of stating the obvious. We don't necessarily need them this year or next year, but if we don't do anything about them, scaling to the volumes and use levels that we'll need to achieve a 2040 greenhouse gas reduction, which is stated as 70, striving for 80% absolute emission reduction, becomes near impossible. And it's certainly highly disruptive if we haven't started use early on. And the logic behind that is the often referenced socio-technical transition theory, that's kind of sigmoid or S-curve, which is also, I find, quite reassuring. This isn't a transition where you need to have made a third of the progress by 2030, i.e. a third of the way through the transition. We only expect to make about 5% of the progress because transitions start slowly and then they gather speed. And so we need to think about where we are in the process of starting slowly, and that's what this work is all about. So the first thing I want to emphasize before we go into the detail is the role of this study is to understand the third of those three arrows, because the other two are very important as well. But this is the one which requires some kind of early thinking of the long-term objective in order to plan and review. The other two doesn't diminish the importance of the other two and the steps that need to be taken there. But it also doesn't mean that the actions on the other two are automatically enabling of this third action. So there's a bit of interference sometimes between these objectives. So we wrote the report as a written report, which optimized it for the portrait layout, and then I've had the challenge of making it more accessible in a landscape layout. So apologies for tilting this over, but hopefully that's not an angle that is too difficult for you to read without a slight incline of your head. But this is a color chart mapping the various statements of progress that we evaluate across the 5 areas that the report focuses on. So technology and supply, that means primarily the fuel and the machinery equipment development. Demand, that means the demand from the customers of shipping and the fleet specifications that are being ordered by ship owners and financiers. Finance, referring to the frameworks and the enabling of finance to flow into the zero emission fuel transition. Policy frameworks, hopefully self-explanatory, and society, civil society, which is more to do with enabling of the ecosystem that helps and assists everything else. So the 3 colors meaning on track, progression in line with the requirements across all actors. So seeing that everything is really in place, partially on track. So some evidence that things are being met, but not sufficient evidence that the range of actors, not everyone, because this is a target of 5%, so not everyone has to be using zero emission fuel by 2030, but the breadth of actors that you would need to hit that target are showing that they're aligned, and then not on track, self-explanatory, not progress in line with the targets that we can break down in the near term. And you can see that across the different areas, we have a mix. Some areas demand is showing the greatest amount of not on track. Finance is universally partially on track, the least interesting of the 5. But generally we've got a bit of a mix. And so the overall conclusion of the study is that the transition is partially on track. And I guess that's I guess that's important to explain. You know, you can sit here in 2023, look at the enormity of the challenge ahead and say it's not possible, and make quite definitive statements. There will not be enough fuel. The fleet cannot be retrofitted. The policymakers can't make policy quick enough, whatever it is. So it's easily possible to be negative about this. This is evidence that you cannot be definitively rejecting of the journey that we're on. It's not possible at this point to say it isn't possible, which is as important as saying that it is possible, because I think we often find ourselves on one side or the other saying one of those extreme cases, and I think it's evident at the moment that we're still in the middle and remain so, and that's a positive situation to be in. So diving into some of the detail on this, because I want to draw out some of the key data in order to kind of share what we think we've learned so far. So this is a composite of the picture which is often discussed, which is, will there be enough fuel and will the fleet be ready in time? So if you like, the positive axis on this bar chart is the supply of fuel. So that's one of the chicken or the egg, and the negative axis is the opposite. It's the demand side. So what the bar charts are showing are a lower bound and an upper bound estimate of where we think we are on both supply and demand, relative to, in the dotted line, the magnitudes that we expect to be available from a fuel production perspective and in use from a fleet perspective by the time we get to 2030. And this is another thing to emphasize about the challenge or the scale of what's ahead. If you look at 2023 and 2025, our estimate of where we need to be isn't that dissimilar. So over a 2-year period, we don't really see very much change. But between 25 and 2030, we expect there to be quite a non-linear increase, so a much more rapid growth. And that's even if we step back and think about the S-curve, we're still in the learning phase. We're still scaling up at this point. But even during scale up, things happen in a way which is quite hard to predict if you're just extrapolating from history. So there's almost zero value in looking at 2 years and then projecting forwards based on what you just saw, because you're invariably going to be wrong. This is a transition which will, if it's anything like any other transition, we'll see some major structural changes even over the next 5 years that will make us re-estimate and recalculate and recalibrate what we think is going to happen. So taking that knowledge that that's typically what happens in a transition, they're kind of chaotic and hard to predict, and they scale much more rapidly than most people expect. We can estimate those dotted lines. That's our best estimate of what that might look like in practice. Now, one of the most common refrains, and this is something I heard quite a lot in Athens at the GMF summit, is there just won't be enough fuel. So we're in a situation where us as ship owners or financiers of ships can be building ships, but we've got no chance of getting anywhere near these ambitions that have been set by the IMO because the supply side isn't in place. And what I guess this is showing is, well, that depends on the assumptions you make. So let's just dive into the light blue and the dark blue bar chart, especially in 2030. So we have a large amount of uncertainty, both on what projects will come to fruition, but also what quantity of the fuel produced in those projects might be usable within the shipping industry. And so we've applied our best estimate of what we think limits are for a lower and an upper bound. So in the low case, which is the dark blue bar chart, we're estimating that 10% of the green ammonia that's produced in 2030 would be supplied to the shipping industry for use as a fuel. 40% of the methanol would be supplied for use as a fuel. And that's based on announcements that have already been made, assuming those come to fruition. So people would say that's already optimistic. A lot of those announcements won't come to fruition. Well, you can factor in some of our magnitude of the share, the 10%, the 40%, as being a sort of way of being conservative about all those projects coming to fruition. So somewhere between those two assumptions, we have a lower bound scenario, which doesn't meet the 5%. So there is a world that evolves over the next 7 years, which would not get us enough fuel within the parameters that we're assuming here. But then we look at an upper bound scenario and say, well, actually, there's a very strong argument for shipping being a user of those fuels in 2030. It's the only sector that's got a global regulator like the IMO that can make policy that can really drive use in the near term. And so a higher amount of the supplied ammonia and methanol would be coming to shipping, 50 and 75% in this case. And we shouldn't assume in 23 that we have all the project announcements for what supply would be available in 2030. There's been a growth in announcements year on year for the last couple of years. There's still time, project build cycles are quite long, but there is still time in 24, in 25 to have new announcements that could materially affect the supply in 2030. So let's allow for an assumption about that. And when we build that in, we've got 50% odd more than the 5% target would demand. So the supply is deeply uncertain, which I think we knew already, but it's also straddling the 5% limit. So the upper bound is exceeding it by a long way. The lower bound is reducing it. Now we need to get better at tracking, and I think we'd like to do a much more rigorous and deep dive into the assumptions behind this as we go into the 2024 work on this. But at least we can't say that there won't be enough fuel. We can say it's within the realms of the scenarios that we can look at. And the key parameters to look at for further refining this are what's the share that shipping might end up using in the timescale. Now, this is just to emphasize, these are green fuels. That means they are produced using electrolysis. There is more fuel than this that's on projects that are associated with lower emissions, but these are the fuels that are aligned to that zero emission scaling objective of the transition curve, that S curve on the previous slide. So this is an attempt to quantify all the different fuels. But the demand side picture is more negative, and I think it's important also to tell a story about that, because it's not definitive. And I think, having had a few chances to present this work already and answer questions, what we have done there for the demand is extrapolate from historical trends. So we know the order book today, we can see how many methanol and ammonia ships are being ordered. And we've taken quite a conservative extrapolation of that out to 2030, which even in the high demand forecast doesn't get us close to the 5% target, the fleet size that you would need to be compatible with the fuel supply in order to have the 5% energy use in a zero emission or near zero frame. And so that, I think, is partly reflecting our ability or inability to model what I think is more likely to be quite a structural shift. So we have lots of reasons why ordering of new builds at the moment is quite conservative, one of which is to do with the uncertainty of the technology choice. So is methanol a long-run solution, or is ammonia going to be rapidly clarified as the viable solution, and therefore also the cheapest? So what do we see as the technology choice is one inhibitor of action at this point. The other is obviously the clarity of the way that the IMO regulates, which should develop over the next 18 months as the IMO reaches adoption of its midterm measures. So the drivers of really strong changing in ordering behavior haven't materialized yet, but we could expect them to within the next 2 years. And that points to me to a likelihood of a more rapid step change as we get to 25, 26, and some of that information is less uncertain, and therefore we still have time. 25, 26, we would still have new builds that should be in service in 2030. We still have some time to reach some of the values. And to put that in context, 0.5% of the fuel, 0.6 exajoules, that 5% target is equivalent to about 615,000 TU container ships that were compatible with those fuels. So it's a big number, but it's not insurmountable as a new building activity. It's obviously fewer than 650,000 TU container ships if it's spread across different ship types. So that's just illustrative, but there are many different combinations, and we can do more work on that. So that's one of the points that often focuses attention. But I think especially moving into COP, one of the other areas I wanted to draw attention to was the role of national action and national level regulatory developments, which are tracked in the report. And we count a good number of countries that now have hydrogen strategies, and a modest number of countries that have some of the other steps. So pilots means programs of pilot funding, infrastructure, referring to significant regulatory action to do with particularly the ports, but also the supply chain of new fuels, some of which is going to be associated with sectors other than shipping. And so we can take some of that into the picture for the policy developments. And we're not far off where we needed to be in the 2025 target for some of those national level regulatory developments, but we don't particularly weight them between these areas. And I think that one of the key ones that we've observed, especially for the early adopters of of zero emission solutions is some sort of government assistance to address the OPEX challenge of an early adopter, not just specifying a ship to run on green ammonia or green methanol, but being able to make that competitive in a market where there's no IMO regulation in place yet. So this is talking about the years 25, 26, 27. What does an operator do to make that work? Well, they can go to the customers and ask them to pay a premium, but if they can't cover that completely, there's still a gap. And some movement towards that is starting to be evident. The US announcement to do with the hydrogen hubs and in particular funding for demand is evidenced, but it's not widespread, and we're yet to see other governments recognize the scale of that OPEX challenge and what will be needed. And I think that's reflected in this data here. So we don't quantify, or we don't weight these. We don't say carbon pricing, for example, is more important than hydrogen strategy, because carbon pricing starts to give you some closing of the OPEX gap or a bit more regulatory assistance on that. Pilots might have some support, but not necessarily to be able to operate a green corridor at scale. It might be a smaller scale support. So we need to do, as a group, I think we need to do some more evaluation to see which of those regulatory developments are really able to help the volume use of fuel, especially if the support that comes in the midterm measures isn't really strong in the period to 2030, and therefore we're very dependent on the national governments for the crossing of the business case for the zero emission fuel use in that period. So I think that this is a snapshot. It's getting a good mark, but I think we need to do more evaluation of where the particular strength is needed. And my initial reaction is that OPEX challenge remains key for national regulatory action. Moving to the finance, the status of finance and finance, we look at a couple of things. We look at the initiatives like deciding principles, but we also look at the subject of sustainability-linked loans, and I'm just sharing the data here for the volume of sustainability-linked loans that we think were associated with shipping. We try to map them onto the maritime sector, in particular the categories of shipyards, ports, and ship owners and operators. The vast majority of sustainability-linked loans have been deployed within the ship owner group. That magnitude of $500 million declined slightly from 21 to 22, but generally speaking, there was a reduction in the global use of those types of bonds, those finance structures between 21 and 22. So that's not to be, I wouldn't draw too many conclusions about that 1 year trend. And it's representative of the more general trend. The total magnitude of sustainability linked loans here is about 0.5% of the total magnitude of sustainability linked loans across all sectors. So total investment is of the order of $100 billion of that category of finance product, of which shipping is looking like it's operating about 0.5% of that. So there's still scope for that to increase, but there isn't very much structure around the credentials of a sustainability linked loan. So whilst we point to there being positive signs that finance is building into these frameworks of specialist bond structures or Poseidon principles alignment, the clarity with which those will really finance zero emission fuel use isn't there. You don't need to set a criteria on pre-2030 zero emission fuel use to qualify for a sustainability linked loan. So it's not a de facto guarantee, and that's why we see our overall assessment of finance as something which is partially on track. You know, the frameworks are appearing, but the materiality of those frameworks is still evolving and not able to kind of completely resolve the alignment of that to the 5% objective. So that's all I had time to sort of dive into in depth. I'm happy to take questions if there are some arising, but just to try and summarize, we're partially on track. As I said, you can define that as a double negative. You can say it's not impossible, which also means that what happens next, i.e. in the next 12 or 18 months, is really important. We're starting to push the constraints of the time that we have left to resolve 2030 issues. And we haven't, I don't think we finalized that, but we don't have much time. And so action is really urgent, which it always is, but I think that's qualified with some justification on this occasion. The picture on supply and demand, supply appears more positive than demand. I think in practice, it's a mix across both. You can write negative stories about either of those. You can blame the other. You know, if you're a stakeholder in the supply sector, you can blame the demand sector and vice versa. neither of those are helpful. I think both of them have got room to meet their objective. There's still time scale for both of them to ramp up, but that is going to need some further work in both areas in order to reduce the uncertainties and make that more investable within the timescales that we have. Policy, there's I haven't drawn much attention to it, but obviously the MEPC 80 outcome is a great move forwards from our analysis in clarifying what's going to happen in the 2030s, the scale of the greenhouse gas emission reduction, and that itself has a really strong effect on the business case in the 2020s, especially for green corridors or dark green corridors that are using fuels that are going to rapidly become very important in the mass market transition of the sector as we go through the 2030s. That 70 striving for 80% absolute emission reduction is, in our calculations, a requirement that the average ship has a 90% lower greenhouse gas intensity by 2040. And that's going to mean a lot of ships having well above that. There are mixed results in other areas of policy, and a clear role for national policy. So the existence of the IMO regulation hasn't meant that governments can now relax and say, right, the multilateral process has got this resolved. You know, if we want to have a smooth transition, the role of national governments is as important as ever, if not more important. But it's a more defined and it's a clarified role because it's not so indeterminate and inexorable as it might have once been. And then finally, finance frameworks exist, but we still need to see more on their alignment. So that's what I wanted to conclude on. But is there anything that I can do to clarify?
Thanks very much, Tristan. I think that what you presented was very clear. We did receive a number of questions in the chat, and I will take it upon me to try and pass those on to you, maybe combine a couple of them actually, because they're covering some similar ground. Whether you're comfortable answering some of these or not, because I think a couple of them are asking you for a little bit of a market view. So a couple of questions about what you think the keys are to delivering the production side, where the constraints are in making those announcements real, whether it's related to feedstock, electricity production, etc. Certainly a question I want to revisit with the panel as well. But if you wanted to share any thoughts there.
I think the main constraint is not taking the IMO seriously and creating narratives that assume failure at the IMO in the next step. So I'm cautious about saying things here, given you're going to ask Alicia and you have Sveinund on the panel as well, but it's extraordinary how many conversations I've been in over the last 6 months where either the stakeholder group hasn't understood or digested the numbers that are in the IMO's revised strategy ambitions, or they have understood them and they're writing a narrative which is negative towards them, i.e. they're basically saying it's all very nice that the IMO has come up with some levels of ambition, but that's just nonsense and it's not going to work in practice. And, you know, I don't think the IMO will actually produce midterm measures. The narrative of failure is really interesting. And it's one of the things that then creates negative sentiment. So we've even been in a situation where we've used some of our evidence with some of the advisors to the investment community, so that kind of consultancies that make their living out of giving advice to investors on what sectors are doing. And we've been asked questions about some of our evidence by those advisors. And it astonishes me that their starting proposition is of a failure of the IMO to regulate. And then the rest of the story is for the volumes that are associated with that. So let's not make a case to the investors that actually there's an opportunity here for the volumes of zero emission fuel, but let's just say, you know, there might be a little bit, but you need to be quite risk entertaining. And that is a really, the way that the finance community and the consultancy community have played with that IMO outcome and bet in a way with their rhetoric around it, I think is the biggest obstacle that we now face. The IMO outcome is a really solid set of numbers and statements. Greenhouse gas well-to-wake emissions reductions mean you have to decarbonize fuel production, and they will guide what happens in the midterm measures next. And so I think that's what we need to work on collectively as a community. Stop that negative rhetoric and express where we need to be conscious that the IMO has a track record of success rather than failure when we look at some of the historical implementation of measures, and try and really embrace what that means in practice. Because if we leave it 3 years and then we wait for the adoption of measures, think we'll be in for a lot more disruption and shock than if we start really thinking about it now.
There are a couple questions. Thank you. And I'll come back to these issues with the panelists, particularly with Alicia, as you mentioned, looking at some of maybe the other potential constraints or concerns from the production perspective. There are a couple of questions in the chat that relate to the finance levers and maybe asking for a view about how impactful sustainability-linked loans are likely to be, how robust they are in actually driving the kinds of investments that are needed in this transition, as described in the report. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, so we write a bit about this in the report. So I'm not trying to heap praise on sustainability linked loans as a bulletproof structure for evaluating what is sustainable. But what they do is give us architecture that can be improved in the same way that the Poseidon Principles adopted initially to be aligned on the initial strategy ambitions and is now being aligned to the IMO's revised strategy ambition. So it was a framework, but now it's a tighter framework. And hopefully it will move to being a 1.5 aligned framework at some point, which is the ultimate test that we set, that we need to be defensively science-based in any voluntary initiative. And the sustainability linked loans need to be the same. And one of the things that happened at COP27, which I like to draw attention to, is the publication of a report by the high-level expert group commissioned by UN Secretary General Guterres, saying what is the minimum requirement to avoid any initiative being greenwash. And that sets a 1.5 aligned trajectory, well-to-weight greenhouse gas emissions framework, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions inclusion, no use of offsets and credits as a minimum requirement to avoid an initiative being greenwash. Now, if a sustainability linked loan is not in compliance with those labels, then the market should be classifying it as meaningless, i.e. it's not managing climate risk. And so this is really down to the market to produce better evaluation, better scrutiny of those loans, but the mechanism exists for that because those loans require the transparent declaration of what it is that you've done in order to justify being a loan of that type. There are certifications. The Climate Bond Initiative, for example, has a certificate which is more rigorous, and hopefully we'll see that being used as a shorthand to avoid market participants having to do a lot of that evaluation themselves. But there's a huge industry behind that. It's going to need to be better regulated, as we've seen in London already. But I think it's about the enabling the framework, not the legitimizing of that as a concept that just solves the problem in its own right.
Yeah. Great.
Jesse, maybe I can just interject, if I may, on that point. I mean,
sorry, Stephen. Well, let's come back to it when we can get you spotlighted in the group,
All
because
right.
other people won't be able to see you. So I definitely will let you come back and on that point. I just wanted to round off. There are a number of questions that are the flavor that I think probably you often get when presenting this material about the scope of fuels and energy sources that are included. Does the picture look different if we include some of the other fuels that you characterize as transitional fuels? And why look specifically at these fuels? I think you provide a little information on that, but because it's a subtle point, maybe it's worth revisiting why this report looks at the fuels that it did.
Yeah, that's a good question. I did actually mean to say that in my spiel, but I was so excited about all the other points I missed it. But so obviously the biggest new building ordering is associated with liquid natural gas. Then we've got methanol, and then we've got ammonia, for which there's very nascent ordering or kind of ammonia ready ordering going on. We also include, and I didn't talk about this, but green corridors, and we did an assessment of green corridors, but we only count the green corridors that were using or stating intent to use the green fuels that we define as being methanol or ammonia produced using electrolytic hydrogen. And we don't include liquid natural gas because of the evidence base that is long running, but also constantly being revised. There's a nice new paper by Chalmers University that gets even synthetic methane. So acknowledges that we can have synthetic methane, but on a well-to-weight basis, they can't get well-to-weight reductions beyond 65% of the conventional fuel. So it's not, even though it's been synthetically produced, it's not getting close to the levels of greenhouse gas intensity reduction that we know we need from the IMO revised strategy. Methanol, they can get to a 92% reduction, ammonia a little bit higher than that. So those are the fuels that cross what we're often now using as a norm here, which is a fuel that can do a 90% lower greenhouse gas intensity than the baseline by the fossils that we have at the moment. Methanol is a really difficult one because obviously the methanol that we talk about most of the time at the moment is biomethanol. That isn't helpful on the supply side. So the investment that goes into biomethanol supply isn't helpful for the zero emission target, except maybe in the bunkering interface where you're developing the bunkering infrastructure, or on the fleet where you can actually see that ships using methanol would be enabled to use that in the future. But we need to test that as we go through this period, that the electrolytic methanol is genuinely a long-term scalable solution, which means solving that source of carbon problem. Where does the carbon come from? Is it direct air capture? Because what else is scalable? So I think there's a question mark on methanol, but we've included it. Ammonia is clear cut, and so we do include that. LNG we don't include. Hopefully that clarifies.
I think we could probably further explore that issue at length, but maybe that's a good point from which to move on to the panel discussion. We thank everybody for their questions in the chat, and thank Tristan very much for presenting the report and joining us here. So thank you, Tristan. And I think maybe we can move on to our panel discussion. And some of the issues we raised in the chat, I think, are very appropriate to raise with this group of panelists. So I will introduce the panelists that are joining us first, and then go to them each with some questions. So first, I'd like to introduce Alicia Eastman, who is president and co-founder of Intercontinental Energy. Intercontinental is a developer and investor in very large-scale upstream wind and solar projects, but also midstream green hydrogen and downstream green ammonia projects. I would also like to ask to be spotlighted German Weiser, who is a senior advisor in research and development for WinGD, where he oversees the strategic development areas such as technologies for future fuels. I would welcome Sveinung Oftedal, who many of you will know, the chief negotiator for green shipping at the Norwegian Ministry of Climate and Environment. Also from the public sector, Olivia Flynn, who is head of international maritime emissions policy at the UK Department for Transport. From MOL, Koichiro Ninomiya, the head of sustainability and non-energy businesses. Welcome, Nino. And Stephen Fuster, global head of shipping finance at ING Bank. And I think you'll maybe notice that with our panelists are covering many of the same areas that the report that Tristan have just presented covers. So we have Alicia representing the fuel production side, Nino representing the demand side as a ship owner. We have Stephen representing finance and two representatives from the policy side. So I think it's a chance. It's a sort of a luxurious chance to get this full picture covered. And we will be open to some exchange between the panelists, but I want to make sure that everybody gets a chance to weigh in from their perspective. And so I'd like to, if I may, sort of go around the table here, the virtual table, and ask you a couple of questions. And I would like to start with Alicia. There were a number of questions in the chat, and I think, as we heard from Tristan, there is a quite large pipeline of fuel production projects, especially taken from the announced projects perspective, but a significant span of uncertainty about how many of those will reach final investment decision and become operational projects. From your perspective as an investor and developer in some of the largest, the very largest green hydrogen and ammonia projects in the world, what do you think are the keys to making sure these become realized? What's your view from the market?
I think, well, first of all, I'm sure everyone is sick of seeing the same slide that shows the announced projects, and now they've added a little bit more detail with in development or at FEED and then FID. And from my point of view, when you announce a project and you don't have a concession and you don't have any license, you don't have any partners, you don't have any permits, it should not be included in the database. But everyone is including this database. It's only in the last year that people have started to distinguish that there's a difference between projects that are in development that have data, that have partners on the ground, that have land, that have, our first project that we announced in Australia has a 100-year lease on the land. So much had been done by the time we talked about our project. But in 2021, 22, I mean, people just announced their feelings or their thoughts about what they might want to do, having never even visited the countries they said they were going to do a project in. That's what really blew me away, is that there were a lot of people talking about projects and they had literally never been to the country. And so I think that database is very flawed on the announcement side. And then we start to just include the ones that are in development. They're gathering data. They are doing a environmental and socioeconomic study. They're working with the local people. I think most of those actually will make it to FID. And the idea that we have, I don't know how many we have in FID now, it's like 20 or 30 or whatever. But a major project, which any ammonia project would be a major project, but you're doing the upstream wind and solar, you're doing the desalination of seawater, you're doing the green hydrogen, all the electrolysis, and then you're doing the Haber-Bosch to make the ammonia, right? So this is a lot of CapEx. And these projects take a long time to build, and they last a long time. An ammonia facility lasts for 50 years. So this takes long-term thinking, and you are not going to get a project approved a year and a half after you announce it. If anyone promises that, they're lying, or they don't know what they're doing, because you have to do many studies. You have to do environmental studies, you have to do socioeconomic impact studies, you have to do, obviously, conceptual designs, you do the pre-feed, the feed, you'd have to get approvals from probably 40 to 50 different organizations in any particular country. Just to give an example, in Oman, you get crookies. So just to put your masts or your tridents, your sodars on the land that you've been allowed to gather data on, you have to get an individual crookie, which is like a little piece of land for like 9 by 9 feet, that you can put your mast in the middle of, and you can't even be off by 1 foot. It's your license is for that little bit of land, and that's it. And it takes a long time to get those. So that's one thing that's one thing in Oman that took a long time, but they have actually redesigned, and they've created sort of a one-stop shop with Hydrome. And now they've gone from one of the more difficult places to actually build a project to an easier place to build a project, because they've thought it through, and they've worked out ways, for everyone's questions to be answered, and it's much more organized. So I would just say, I don't think it's surprising that, major projects that normally take 6 years. I mean, an oil and gas project is 6 to 10 years. And we've only been announcing projects since 2020. The first project that was announced was NEOM. The first major, integrated upstream wind and solar, hydrogen and ammonia project was NEOM in 2020. So, they're not going to be delivering until 26 or something like that, which makes sense. So if anyone else announced last year, well, it's going to be 6 years before they have products, before, they're actually able, that's like in a good day, that's hitting FID. And then you also have to actually get shovels in the ground. You have to build the project and start commercial operations. So it just takes a long time. And it's one of the reasons that I'm surprised, or I'm not surprised, but I think it's a mischaracterization to say that there's not enough demand. I think most shipping companies don't think methanol is the answer. We all know that the biogenic CO2 is very hard to get. We know that aviation has almost no options except for e-kerosene, which also requires biogenic CO2. There is a cap, and you may have more faith in it and think that it could get to X size, but there's no cap on ammonia. We can make ammonia forever. All you need is seawater, you need sun, you need wind, and you need nitrogen. 80% of the air is nitrogen. So we will never run out of these materials. And I think that is just obviously more attractive, in addition to it being cheaper, zero emissions instead of, still polluting. I mean, there's just so many things that make it more attractive. But unfortunately, there's been a lot of I don't know, a sideline into methanol, which has wasted a lot of support that could go behind ammonia. And the reason that most of the companies are not supporting ammonia financially or not investing in it is because they just think it's going to happen. They look at all the projects that have been announced and they're like, okay, it's going to happen because, Japan's going to co-fire it, and, it's going to be useful for cracking back into hydrogen, to be used for chemicals, or to be used for steel, or et cetera, et cetera. But it's just a free rider effect. Like, people are thinking that ammonia will happen. Like, they actually have more faith in ammonia. That argument doesn't need to be made, but they have so much faith that they think it'll just get done without them. And so you have this sort of prisoner's dilemma where it's in your best interest to sit back and wait. But if everybody sits back and waits, then nothing gets done. And I think that that's the main issue. And I look at this in sort of four different areas, a framework of four areas. So you have the supply and demand, which is the commercial side. And then you have, on the regulatory side, you have carrots and sticks. And I think that, in order to get all the different parties motivated, the first movers should be able to have some kinds of carrots if they are a producer or a buyer of a green fuel. And people who do not change at a certain time, there should be sticks, and the taxes that are collected should be used to actually help the industry to build out infrastructure, to invest in a new type of fuel.
Let me ask you to pause there, Alicia. We have to get to a lot of people here, and we have quite limited time. So, but I thank you for injecting some of the more practical considerations. I think I heard quite a balanced picture there that some of these things are actually much more complicated than they're communicated, but also that there is very significant overall potential to be realized. So, I think we should maybe jump to a different part of the value chain. German, I wanted to come to you. WinGD is very active in developing technologies, including ammonia engines, for example. The report, Tristan, didn't go much into the technological development aspects of the report, but the report views that as performing pretty well, largely on track, the development of the necessary technologies to be ready by 2030. I wanted to ask you to maybe comment on looking beyond the development of these technologies. How do you see the scalability and the potential for supply bottlenecks from, for example, engine technologies and vessels between now and 2030?
That's a very valid point that you're addressing here. We and the entire industry are investing considerable efforts as we speak in order to bring the technology that is required for the broad adoption of these new fuels in the market. And we do that on a very tight and unprecedented schedule as fast as possible. At present, unfortunately, we do not see the demand side evolving accordingly. As is also mentioned in the report, if we wish to achieve the target, new tonnage that is going into operation needs to be more and more, or even almost exclusively, be prepared for the application of these new fuels. And even beyond that, we will have strong drivers towards the conversion of existing tonnage and also the replacement of existing capacity by SZEF capable vessels well ahead of the usual fleet renewal schedules. So I think there is something that needs to happen there. And let me make a general statement. I like a lot the conclusion that Tristan came up with. It is not impossible. It is not impossible if we get going now, and if we put the right levers, if we pull the right levers and make sure that the proper drivers are brought in place.
Thank you, Goran. And while I was originally going to go to Sveinung next. I think you've set up really Nino to be the next respondent, and we did hear from Tristan that the vessel side, so to speak, representing the demand is a little behind track, and German has reemphasized that. MOL is a company that has published. It's been very transparent about its fleet renewal plans, and I wonder how you see the prospects for actually delivering that strategy that MOL has published.
Thank you, Jesse. I'm Nino. Hi, everyone. So I've been in UK from 2018, and looking back, even in Europe, would I have imagined IMO MEPC80 outcome? I'm very surprised in a good way, and I think coalition like these are doing a great job kind of putting the participants together. So MOL is one of the largest shipping companies in the world. We operate around 800 vessels, various sectors, so tankers, dry bulk carriers, car carriers, LNG carriers, etc. So we kind of have diverse fleets, and we've set a vision to get to net zero by 2050, and we've set the milestones to like introduce use 5% zero emission fuel by 2030, install 25 ships with Wind Challenger sails by 2030, and have 130 zero emission fuel vessels ocean going by 2035. So we are very keen to take part on this transition, and we've been really encouraged with working together with the partners, many in this panel and in this forum. So thank you for that. On the prospects, I think the biggest problem is actually it's not the ships, it's not the engines, it's the cost of the fuel. So it's the operation running cost, and that's the real challenge we need to address. I think without having a mechanism on a global scale to bridge that gap, it's going to be very difficult to for the big transition to happen. This curve that Tristan showed, I think that's a very valid possible scenario, but to make that happen, it's really the cost of the fuel. So I'd really like to see that be addressed. On the good news, I think there's two things. First is IMO is aware of the this challenge. So in 2025, there'll be a mechanism of basket of measures to hopefully make the gap much narrower. And secondly, there are already dual-fueled engines or designs for ammonia or methanol-ready vessels. So whilst we await for the price gap adjusting mechanism to come in place, and await for the 6, 7, 8 years projects to come in line, we ship owners can get on and order these vessels. So I think that's we're pretty positive on the prospects. Yeah,
that's very encouraging, and I think that we've set the table for the discussion of policy now, and I want to go to Sveinung. Tristan, we really tried to emphasize that the adoption of the revised strategy is underappreciated in its scope and the magnitude of impact that it should have, and that it needs to be reinforced. Nino has referred to the need to establish mechanisms, and of course that's the next step, right, from the strategy. I wanted to ask you from your perspective, as we move into the next phase of negotiations, what do you see as some of the essential questions that need to be handled at the IMO to keep the process on track?
I think I will start by saying, using your last word, to keep the process on track. That is a key thing, that there is no doubt out there that there will be a follow-up. So my communication to everybody I'm speaking to, you should be certain that there will be a follow-up, and then we will keep our timeline on the measures. So because if there starts to be doubt on that, I think then there is doubt in investments. Now, the good thing is I am very aware that many member states and also observer organizations are working very hard in the follow-up. So the communication is there is now work ongoing on the follow-up. In order to have a new set of requirements be in place as we agreed in the strategy, actually 2024 is the year, because we need to approve a legal text in spring 2025, meaning that all this text on the measure need then to be developed and agreed during the 2024, so we can approve in the spring 2025 and be adopted the autumn 2025 and enter into force in 27 and start doing a job for reduction of measures. Meaning that all parties need to understand that actually at the first juncture when we negotiate in March, we need to come to some sort of agreements on, it cannot now be ideas and going in different direction. We need to align and make this into one document. Now, when it comes to the measure as such, and of course there can be several recipes on how to reduce emissions and how to ensure that there will be invested in an energy shift. It is about the totality, can it be feasible, the legal mechanism, can it be complied with by the industry, what will be the response when it comes to the response in the industry, can it be enforced, etc. The other element, which is, so that was the first. The other element is, of course, how to take into account the life cycle emissions, which is, addressed in the strategy. We need to take them into account and how to capture that in a legal mechanism. And then, of course, this is a member state agreement, meaning that this is needed to assess the impact on states, and that work is ongoing now. So we have started to look into how this transition, when it comes to the measures, will have impacts on states and how we then will respond to it. So there is many elements which we need to take quite tough decisions on, but I'm quite confident that actually the atmosphere we experienced this summer will continue in our process.
Thank you very much, Simon. That's also encouraging, and I think we all agree that the achievement of July was a major one. Olivia, I wanted to ask you for your views, particularly on what you think might be points of emphasis, big challenges for the international negotiations process.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. And I must say, I really agree with what Sveinung has reflected on. And I think my own reflections are broadly quite similar, but I think when we think about the challenges that face us, it's also important to reflect on how far we've come. So Nino touched on this as well, that maybe in 2018, we wouldn't have predicted that we would be where we are in 2023. But I think even this time last year, ahead of COP27, we didn't have an agreement on our destination. And now we have a clear sense of where we're going. We have a net zero goal, interim targets, emissions coverage, a timeline for policy development. And I think that's something to really celebrate. It took a lot of work, it took a lot of late nights, and we were able to reach an agreement that everybody could support, and that's a huge achievement. But I mean, obviously that's not the full story. We know the destination, we still need agreement on how we're going to get there. And I could keep extending the metaphor to build the ship together, but I won't labor the point. The important message is that the strategy is one thing, but it's the regulations that are going to deliver the emissions cuts that we really need to see to stay on track for 1.5 degrees. So I think there's three kind of key challenges in terms of policy development. And firstly is data. We currently don't have the whole picture when it comes to what the various policy proposals have been in practice in terms of economic, environmental, and wider impacts. And the urgency of climate change means that sometimes we do have to operate on the basis of maybe not having 100% of the information on the precautionary principle. But at the IMO, we're fortunate to have recourse to a comprehensive impact assessment process that will give us the kind of solid evidence on the impacts on the fleet and impacts on the states, including on developing countries, particularly SIDS and LDCs. So once we have that evidence, we can then finalize the policy design. So the IMO has made obviously impressive strides in this space, but getting to mature policies that are ready to adopt will take some more consideration before we adopt in 2025 and implement in 2027 as agreed during the summer. And thankfully, there are already a number of viable measures on the table, and also a lot of excellent examples of emissions reductions regulations in other sectors that we can learn from. And finally, then, once you have the data, once you have the policy design, we come to the agreement, which Sveinung has mentioned, we need to align. All the moving parts around evidence, policy, compliance and monitoring arrangements, legal amendments, and potentially new revenue streams can progress to a certain point, but then it's going to be for the member states to, again, do the hard work, do the long nights, and come to a package that everybody can agree to at MEPC 83. So clearly, I mean, there's a significant workload ahead of us, but this group has been doing this kind of work together for several years now. We've built that trust, we've built those relationships, we've built that expertise, and as long as we continue to do so, we should be able to overcome those challenges.
Thank you, Olivia. Stephen, I wanted to come to you next, and you know, investors respond to policy, but in this space, the investment community also has a role as leaders in the transition to a certain extent, and for example, through initiatives like the Poseidon Principles, where you're the treasurer of the initiative, and the leadership shown by proactive work on, for example, sustainability-linked loans, which we looked at or we discussed earlier. How do you see that space evolving, the leadership space in finance, and what is the way forward for that? How can finance do more to promote the transition? And in the course of that answer, if you want to go back to some of the questions that were raised earlier about the robustness of these investments in driving meaningful on the ground change, would be happy to hear your views.
All right, thanks, Jesse. Well, I mean, you saw from Tristan's graphic that finance is partially on track. So I guess, you know, the good news is there was no red, but the bad news is there was no green either. So clearly, you know, we've got a lot to do as an industry. Tristan also referred to Poseidon Principles and sustainability improvement loans. Now, Poseidon Principles was established in 2019. At the time, it was 10 banks. Today, it's 34 banks. And you know, when it was established, we adopted the IMO target of a 50% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050. Now, the limitation with that, and actually with sustainability-linked loans, and sustainability-linked loans really have adopted the IMO target, is that 50% reduction is not going to get us clearly and obviously to net zero. All it's really doing is encouraging banks to finance the current generation of ships, but the most efficient, or to finance modifications to existing vessels, neither of which will get us to net zero. If we want to get to net zero, we need to be financing new technologies. So that's quite an important point, I think. And sustainability-linked loans didn't always have either rigorous enough targets or sufficient targets. And I think, you know, one of the reasons you saw, again, in Tristan's presentation, the volume of sustainability-linked loans coming down is because banks were coming under increasing scrutiny to make sure that they weren't greenwashing. So to summarize that sort of introduction, Poseidon Principles' existing target and sustainability-linked loans isn't going to drive a change to new technology. It just encourages to improve the efficiency of the existing technology, which is not enough. So what are the levers we can pull? Well, I'm happy to say that, you know, one of the levers we have pulled is that Poseidon Principles have now adopted the IMO revised targets, which came out of MEPC 80. And we're going to release the Poseidon Principles report in the next few weeks. And banks will have to compulsorily report on the 50% reduction target, but voluntarily will report upon the minimum and the striving for targets. And as from next year, that will be mandatory to report on those last two. Now, those targets, as we all know, are much, much more stringent, and they will encourage, I believe, that technology shift which we require to achieve these targets. Likewise, the sustainability-linked loans, and Tristan again touched on this. What we need to do is we need to have a common set of standards, so that if you want to label something as a sustainability-linked loan, there are, and it can be a basket of targets for sure, but there has to be minimum standards that you have to achieve in order to be able to apply that label. The other thing that I think we need to do as an industry, and Alicia touched on this, I think she said that people are sitting back and waiting. And certainly when I talk to my ship owner clients, that's very much the impression that I get. Everyone's sort of looking at the next person sitting next to them, hoping that they will make the first move. And if we do that, we're probably going to sit around forever. And what we really need is, and I hate to say this word, collaborate, because it's often an overused word, but that is what we need. And if we can get the industry to collaborate, the banks will be there to finance. But too often what we see is that banks are expected to take risks which they're not equipped to take. So by that, I mean we're being asked to take technology risk or market risk. And if we really want to be able to move the industry forward, what we need is the engine manufacturers and the shipyards to give warranties around technology. We need the owners to take the operating risk. We need a charterer to provide a long-term charter to take the market risk. And we need the energy companies to provide long-term supply contracts. If you can get all of those things together, that's where the banks can step in and we take credit risk. We're not here to take technology risk, market risk, etc. What we take, what we get paid for, is credit risk. If you can get all of those things together, that's exactly what we will do. We'll take the credit risk on the shipyards and the engine manufacturers in terms of their warranties. We take credit risk on the owner and the credit risk on the charterer. If you can get those things together, then the shipping industry really can move forward, and finance will be there to support it. So I think that's kind of the levers that we can pull in the short term, Jesse. But it does require, say, everyone to move together.
Thank you, Stephen. And I think that the picture you paint of the sort of commercial package that's necessary is very, very useful, right? We're seeing that in a lot of our work, that industry hasn't necessarily taken that step of putting those pieces together, and that's going to be an important complement to the policy support that's needed. But it's none of the things you suggested as crucial are alien concepts, right? Those things should be doable. I think we need to develop. Would you agree with that? That this is not an impossible combination of levers?
It's not impossible at all. And in fact, I'm already starting to hear that the industry is starting to collaborate. I gather some of the mining houses are potentially ready to sort of commit long term. That the technology is largely there, or will be there by the time the ship is due to deliver. And then I say I'm sure that the banks will finance it. We can't go beyond taking a traditional role of a bank, which is to take credit risk.
Right. I want to shift gears here a little bit, because the context for this stock take, this discussion about where we are and what's needed, is excuse me, the upcoming COP28 in Dubai. And that gives us a chance to think about the role of national governments, right? So obviously national governments participate in the IMO, and their key role is in developing a global regime that will guide this transition. But there are presumably actions that national governments can take to support, especially this early phase of transition. You referred, Alicia, to first movers and the need for support. I'd like to, if we could, because we have limited time, go around the panel and keep it to 45 seconds if we can, and quickly characterize what we think national governments can do to support international shipping decarbonization beyond their role in the IMO. And I will start at the top again with you, Alicia.
I think that the best thing they can do is, provide a really welcoming environment for investment. So they provide, maybe it's a special economic zone. It has taxes deferred for 20 years or whatever. The land is very inexpensive, and clients are there in the industrial cluster with them. So you build a big facility. Some of it might go to making shipping fuel, but some of it might go to making steel, and you can create a circular economy too. I think if there's any country that has resources should absolutely do this. This is the easiest way to maximize all the different players and get everybody on the same page. But then there are countries that really don't have resources, and a lot of those could actually play in the supply chain because Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, these are not places that are going to have really good diurnal profile of wind and solar. They have squally skies. I mean, there's not a lot of renewables, but they'll definitely be able to make electrolyzers and PV and a lot of what is necessary for the supply chain. So I think that government should concentrate on what it is they can do, and those two buckets seem to be a good fit for almost every country. Falls into one of those categories.
That's a very good addition. The idea of national industrial policy can have an impact throughout the supply chain. It sets up the question for you, Garma, quite well. I wonder if you have a view on that.
Well, I can only support what Alicia has just said. It's two things, and I would like to add one more thing. The first thing is to create a favorable environment. That's certainly true. The second thing is to grasp opportunities that this transition offers. And I think that's a very important thing, specifically also for countries in the global south, where probably there are bigger opportunities around than for the countries that many of the people around the table are representing here. And the third thing is that countries collaborate in order to support the IMO in developing the appropriate measures to do away with some of the barriers that we have identified in the previous round. So first of all, work together in supporting the development at the IMO, and then also speed up the transition and the transfer into national legislation in order to support the implementation.
Thank you. Nino, do you have any thoughts on what kind of message you think should be sent to national governments in advance of COP?
Yes. I think I agree totally with Alicia and German, and I think one thing to add maybe is to connect. So that's connecting the clusters and connecting the shipping industry to the hydrogen hubs, to the fuels, etc. So that's definitely an ask for the government, and really push the green corridors where it works. It makes sense to be the first movers. We'd like to take part in that. So I really like the governments to encourage developing the corridors.
Terrific. So collaboration between national governments, even outside of the IMO. So I know you're involved with a lot of Norway's domestic work as well. So any thoughts from you?
I would say it even harder. I would say that national climate action on shipping is more or less a prerequisite for the IMO and global shipping to succeed. Simply because the domestic and short sea shipping will be needed to get the ball rolling on the deep sea. And it is actually 300 million tons of CO2, which is on the Paris Agreement. And there the governments have a toolbox consisting of many elements. It can be, I'm talking now about the national context, but it is to require, to stimulate, to support, and also cooperate with the private sector on this transition. So meaning, before we point to others, always start looking at yourself in the mirror. What can I do? And almost everybody can do something at home. And to take it even further, shipping is a need for a transition on land to make it happen at sea. So I could speak long about this, but yes, we can do something, all of us at home.
Thank you. I'll pass the challenge to you, Olivia. I know that the UK has been quite proactive on its domestic shipping strategy. I wonder if you want to add any thoughts to what Svein said.
Yeah, absolutely. As you note, the UK has a clean maritime plan that is currently undergoing a bit of a revision, and we're kind of looking at what kind of interventions are needed on the domestic side. So that's kind of coming down the pipeline in terms of like updates and that type of thing. And I think it's really important to kind of look at that domestic space, and then also how we support the development of progress at the IMO, and then what are the kind of different connections that exist between those two things. So looking at the kind of bilateral and the kind of network focused things around green corridors is obviously the best example of that. The UK has been taking a lot of steps since we launched the Clydebank Declaration at COP26 to kind of encourage further signatories, get more people involved in that work, but also to kind of make good on the commitments that we've done. So setting up the International Green Corridor Fund under our UK Shore Shipping Office for reducing emissions, forming partnerships with countries including the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark. And I think what we've learned from those is for domestic action and for bilateral action and network-based action, it's important to identify stakeholders that are engaged and accountable and have regular engagement with them, to use the available information and the data to inform decisions through route analysis or feasibility studies, but also following kind of pathways and plans, such as one of the many roadmaps that are out there. And also bilateral funding, tapping into those resources where you have them to kind of open more doors or investment decisions. So it's really about finding those partnerships or those networks, having those collaborative discussions, and then identifying the right next steps from there.
Thank you, Olivia. And as you see, we're a little bit over time, and we had to say goodbye to Alicia already. Stephen, any brief message to national governments at COP before we wrap up?
Yeah, look, sure. I mean, I could talk about market-based measures, but that's a big topic and often covered elsewhere, so I won't go into that. But, you know, one of the things I would like to see is that, yes, we develop this sort of defined set of criteria for what we would call a sustainability-linked loan. And that once we have that the banking regulators would then allow us to apply a lower level of capital to that loan, which could then mean we can provide cheaper cost of funding. The flip side of the coin is that for older polluting vessels, we're required to allocate a higher level of capital, and therefore we need to charge more. So by doing that, we could really make a difference in pricing. We could really widen the gap between the cost of financing old vessels and the cost of financing zero carbon vessels.
Two-sided lever. That's an excellent point. We are at time now. I want to first of all thank our panelists and thank you all the participants in the webinar, in the audience for staying on a little over time. I think it was a very interesting and very comprehensive discussion. Thank you for bringing all the perspectives that you brought. I'm not going to add any other perspectives on substance, but just to say that the Getting to Zero Coalition, of course, is actively involved in preparations for COP28 ourselves, and for coalition members, we'll be sharing an update soon about activities happening there. And of course, as a member, you can always reach out to someone on the team if you have questions. So thank you again for your presence today and your very valuable contributions. Thank you for Tristan, who's off screen as well. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Getting to Zero event. Thank you all.
Thank you.